Hey guys, so we're going to start reading chapter 14 today. This week we're going to be reading 14, 15, 16, and 17. As we read this week, we're going to be looking for places where it goes from a narrative to informational. So I'm going to be trying to fill that out as we go too, but we're going to look for places that shift and show the central idea. So we're looking for where it goes story, 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 and to where it flips over to informational. All right, so if you remember from the past chapters, Louie and Phil and Mac survived the crash. They are in these tiny little life rafts. Mac has eaten all the chocolate that was their only supplies that were left. And they've been just like sitting on the ocean. Nobody's found them. There's been a plane that's come by but did not recognize them. So they've seen two planes and neither of those planes have seen them. And their parents have been notified that they are missing in action. Okay, and Louie's mom is convinced. Nothing can convince her that that Louie is not alive. All right, so we're going to start with chapter 14, Thirst. Phil felt as if he were on fire. The men's scalded skin cracked and their lips ballooned, bulging against their nostrils and chins. Ooh, so their lips are so swollen that it's hitting the top of their nose and the bottom of their chin. They're so swollen from the salt. Their feet were catered with quarter-size salt sores. The water cans were empty, the rafts baked, emitting a bitter smell, and the sharks circled. At last, on the third day, without water, down came rain. The men spilled their bodies back, spreading their arms and opened their mouths as the water drummed over them. It was a sensory explosion. They had to find a way to save the water. The water tins, open to the downpour, caught virtually nothing. Louie grabbed the air pump cases, tore the seams, spread the fabric into bowls, and let the rain pool, sucking it up and spitting it into the cans. Once the cans were full, he kept harvesting the rain, and each man took a drink every 30 seconds or so. So Louie is being very resourceful here, even though that's kind of gross that he was spitting the water into the cups. But, I mean, you got to do what you got to do. For the moment they had water, but they still had no food. They were ravenous. They stared into the ocean, crowded with fish, but they had no bait. They studied their shoes and wondered if they could eat the leather. They're so hungry, they're thinking about eating the leather on their shoes. They decided that they couldn't. Days passed. They grew weaker. Louie resented Mac for eating the chocolate, and Mac seemed to know it. Louie sensed that he was consumed by guilt. 9 or 10 days after the crash, Louie was lying back, wearing the air pump case as a hat, when he felt something light on his head. It was an albatross. Slowly, Louie raised his hand, fingers open, and then clamped down on the bird's legs. The bird pecked frantically, slashing Louie's knuckles. Louie grabbed its head and broke its neck. Louie used the pliers to tear the bird open. The men recoiled, so they backed up at the smell. The bird reeked. They tried to eat it, but gagged at the stench. Eventually, they gave up. At last, they finally had bait. Louie tied a small hook to a fishing line and baited it with albatross meat and fed it into the water. A shark bit down on the hook and severed the line. So even though they now have meat to put on their hooks to fish, the sharks keep breaking the line. Twice more Louie tried, and twice more sharks stole his hook. Finally, the sharks let the hook hang. Louie felt a tug and pulled on the line, and on it was a slender fish. It was the first food in well over a week. Between the three men, a small fish didn't go very far, but it gave them a push of energy. Louie had demonstrated that if they were persistent and resourceful, they could catch food, and he and Phil felt inspired. But Mac remained unchanged. Phil reminded Louie that according to lore or legend, killing an albatross was bad luck. After a plane crash, Louis replied, "What more bad luck could they have?" Don't ever say that. Several days passed. Louis caught nothing, and his hook supply dwindled. Periodically, rain replenished water tins, but only part of the way. Phil began thinking about a magazine article that he'd read, written by World War I ace pilot Eddie Rickenbacker. The previous fall, Rickenbacker's bomber had ditched into the Pacific. The raft-bound crew drifted for weeks, surviving on their 2 rafts' provisions, rainwater, fish, and bird meat. One man had died, and the rest had hallucinated, babbling at invisible people and arguing about their imaginary car. One man speaking to a ghost that tried to lure him into the ocean. Finally, the raft split up, and one reached an island. Natives radioed for help, and the other men were rescued. Rickenbacker wrote that he had drifted for 21 days. He had actually drifted for 24. So they're talking about, I wonder if we'll beat the record for being on a raft, because they've been on it now for like 11 or 12 days. So they're like, Rickenbacker was on it for 24 and all of his men went crazy. Louis and Mac and Phil believed that this was the record. In fact, the record for an inflated raft survival appears to have been set in 1942, when 3 crash victims survived for 34 days. To Louis, the most important aspect of Rickenbacker's story was how quickly the survivors had gone crazy. He remembered a college instructor telling him to think of the brain as a muscle, needing exercise to stay in shape. Louis was determined to keep himself and the others aware. Soon after the crash, Louis began peppering Phil and Mac with questions on every conceivable subject. They shared their stories from the first memories onward. They reminisced about their best dates they'd ever had. Phil sang church hymns. Louis taught the other 2 the lyrics to White Christmas. They sang it over the ocean, a Christmas carol in June, heard only by the circling sharks. But every conversation meandered back to food. Louis boasted about his mother's cooking, so Phil asked him how she would make a meal. Louis began describing the preparation of a dish, and all 3 men found it satisfying. So Louis began a daily ritual, describing breakfast, lunch, and dinners. Devouring each imaginary meal, the men would describe every mouthful. They conjured up the scene so vividly that their stomachs were fooled, if only briefly. Once the food was eaten and the past exhausted, they moved to the future. Louis laid plans to open a restaurant. Phil spoke about seeing the Indy 500 and maybe teaching school. And he talked about Cece. In his mind, she never left him. For Louis and Phil, the conversations kept their minds sharp and pulled them out of their suffering and set the future before them as something to live for. But Mac usually sat in silence. Though the others encouraged him, he couldn't see a future. For him, the world was too far gone. One thing, though, that they never discussed was the crash. Louis wanted to, but something about Phil stopped him. Phil's the pilot. At times, Phil seemed lost in troubled thoughts, and Louis was guessing that he was reliving the crash, perhaps feeling responsible for his men's death. Louis wanted to reassure Phil that he had done nothing wrong, but he feared the issue would be painful for him, so he said nothing. 2 weeks had passed, so that's 14 days on a raft in the ocean. The rafts were decomposing, so they're falling apart. Decomposing is a good word. Think about when you've chewed gum just a little too much and it starts falling apart in your mouth. That's what the rafts are doing. They're decomposing, bleeding vivid yellow dye onto the men. They looked grotesque. Salt sores were marching up their legs and backs. Their flesh had evaporated. They were reaching a stage of their ordeal that for other castaways had been a gruesome turning point. Okay, we've been hearing story, because it's been telling us about Louis and Phil and Mac and what's been happening to them. But now we're about to get some information. Right here, it's telling us about the seafaring men and cannibalism. Cannibalism is where you eat other people. They were reaching a stage of their ordeal that for other castaways had been a gruesome turning point. In the history of seafaring, incidents of cannibalism among starving castaways weren't uncommon. So the central idea of that section, the who is the seafaring men. What did they do? Resorted to cannibalism. Where? When stranded. So then you would use, so now since we saw that it shifted from the narrative to talking about giving us information on cannibalism. So it's, the central idea is that the men would resort to cannibalism when stranded on the ocean. Okay. But for all three of the Green Hornet survivors, the idea was unthinkable. Cannibalism would not be considered ever. The 2-week mark was a different turning point for Louis. He began praying out loud. He had no idea how to speak to God, so he recited snippets of prayers that he had seen in the movies. Phil bowed his head as Louis spoke, offering amen at the end, but Mac only listened. The second albatross fluttered onto Louis's head on the 14th day. Again, Louis caught and killed it. When Louis opened it, they were relieved to find that it didn't smell bad, and they ate all of it. Because Mac was fading the fastest, they gave him all the blood. Time spun out endlessly. Baiting his hooks with albatross meat and tiny fish from the bird's stomach, Louis caught a few fish, once parlaying a little one thrown into the raft by a whitecap into bait that yielded a bigger fish. Rains came intermittently, leaving the men sucking up every drop. Louis and Phil took turns leading prayers. Mac remained in his own world. When the rain stopped and the water tins dried up, they reached day 21. That's 3 weeks on the raft. They caught a fish and celebrated passing what they thought was Rickenbacker's record. Louis was out of bait. Other than sharks, the only sea creatures that ventured within an arm's reach were the small pilot fish that swam beside the sharks, but when Louis tried to grab them, they scooted away. With no more small hooks, Louis tried albatross bones, but the fish spat them out. He had an idea. He used fishing line to tie large hooks to his pinky, middle finger, and thumb, orienting them like claws. So he's not working with the hooks. The hooks are not working, so he ties hooks to every one of his fingers like he's got claws. He held his hand over the water and waited. A shark, attended by a pilot fish, swam by. Once its head passed, Louis sank his hand into the water. When the pilot fish moved under his hand, he snapped his fingers shut and yanked it from the water, jubilant. Sometime that week, a tern landed on the raft. That's another bird. And Phil clapped down on it. It was tiny and offered little meat, but not long after, another tern arrived. This time Mac caught it, using his teeth to rip the feathers out. Louis soon felt a tickle on his chin. The tern was teeming with lice. Ugh. Louis rubbed his face, but the lice burrowed into his beard and hair. Frantic, he pitched his upper body into the water. Realizing that Louis was going to get his head ripped off, Phil and Mac grabbed the oars and bumped the sharks away while Louis splashed. Finally, the tickle was gone. As the days passed, the men caught a few more birds. One kept dipping over the raft and soaring off again. Then one day, Mac suddenly shot up his hand and snagged the bird by the leg and handed it to Louis, who was amazed. The men ate every morsel. For days, Louis lay over the side of the raft, his fish hooks on his fingers, trying in vain to catch another fish. Day after day had passed with no rain, and the thirst was agonizing. Twice they had tried to row towards squalls, but each time the rain died as they reached it. When the next squall passed, they were too weak to even chase it. On the 6th day without water, the men knew that they weren't going to last much longer. Mac was failing especially quickly. They bowed their heads together as Louis prayed. If God would quench their thirst, he vowed, he would dedicate his life to him. The next day, the sky broke open and rain poured down. It gave them just enough water to last a little longer, if only a plane would come. Okay, so the only part in this section, I was looking for my notebook. So if we were going to record where the narrative shifts, the only place that's not story, most of this chapter is narrative. So, but there is one place where it goes from narrative to informational. That one place that happens is where it talks about the history of seafaring men and cannibalism. So, if we had to, we're going to come up with a central idea for that section and then add some supporting details. So we need to do the who, what, when, where, and why. Okay, so the who, where the narrative shifts, are starving castaways. What do? They resort to cannibalism. When does this happen? When they've been adrift for over 2 weeks. Where? Stranded on the ocean. And the why, the author's purpose is to inform. So that section itself, the reason why he stops the narrative is he wants to create a central idea. So there's the who, what, when, where, why. We're going to create a central idea. So the central idea is that starving castaways resorted to cannibalism when stranded. Okay, so now we got to provide some supporting details. We need at least 2. So let's see. It says incidents of cannibalism. That's a quote. Among starving castaways. Weren't uncommon. Okay. Now we need at least one more. Let's see. They were reaching a stage of their ordeal that for other castaways had been a gruesome turning point. So it's a gruesome turning point. Okay, so what we did, we noticed where the story shifts. It's gone from talking about Louis and them to there's a quick place where the story shifts to informational when it starts talking about previous sailors resorting to cannibalism. So I did my who, what, when, where, and why from that section. Then I created a central idea sentence, which was starving castaways resorted to cannibalism when stranded. And then I came up with 2 details, 2 quotes from the story to back it. Okay, y'all. That's all for this chapter. And I will talk to y'all later. Y'all have a good day.